All right, sweet. Well, technical difficulties aside, thank you for jumping on and being generous with your time today.
No
Um,
problem.
really excited to talk about the book. I guess if you're comfortable just sharing a little bit about your background, I think it helps people kind of get the sense for why you wrote this book and why you're the perfect person to sort of draw the parallels between Vedic tradition or Eastern traditions, well, as well as other traditions to the Star Wars universe and the Force.
Sure. No, I'd be happy to. So I grew up in a family of meditators. So I started meditating when I was 10, and that was just kind of the lens that we looked at things from. I read books like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads with my dad when I was a kid, and I always just found them so fascinating. So that was kind of the lens I grew up with. And so when I watched the Star Wars movies, it was very clear with the ideas of the Force and the Jedi. It was very clear some of the spiritual principles that had been put in these movies. And so it was fun later on when I started researching for the book to discover that George Lucas had very intentionally done this, that he said himself he was very much influenced by Eastern traditions in coming up with the idea of the Force, but that he also had a very universal perspective in mind when he created the first Star Wars screenplay, a very universal perspective that there are these universal truths that are found in many, many different religions and philosophies. And he was trying to distill the essence of all religions, those were his words, distill the essence of all religions with his idea of the Force. So, by going back to myself, just to finish up, again, grew up in a family of meditators, and then I did my undergraduate degree in history. But by the time I finished that, I realized that my real passion was for the Eastern philosophy, and especially the Vedic teachings of ancient India. So I went on to do my master's and PhD in that, and now I teach that.
Awesome. I mean, that's a great little blurb for the listeners to kind of understand who you are and where you're coming from and where you approached uh, this topic and this book that you wrote. It's cool to know that you grew up as a meditator too. We'll get into the value, or I have a few questions about the value of meditation as it relates to Star Wars, just from reading the book that we'll get to later. But the book is called One with the Force, 18 Universal Truths in Star Wars. And, there's a lot to unpack. I didn't, I was, when we were thinking about talking, I was like, should we go in chronology of the movies or should we go in chronology of the chapters in the book? And I think we're gonna. My questions are going to be a little bit sporadic, but hopefully they'll all kind of touch the key points that you tried to bring across in the book. I guess for me, it all starts with the Force, right? The Force is the central theme, I guess, if you will, within the Star Wars movies. And right out the bat in the book, you equate the Force sort of to the Vedic concept of Brahman. And I think you pointed out three similarities. It's associated with energy, it's all pervading, and it's beyond the physical senses. I'm wondering if maybe you could take us on a little journey through that comparison and just expand upon that a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, in the Star Wars movies, they talk about the Force as this energy field that just permeates everything, connects everything, and that the Jedi can feel it directly. So it's not just a matter of belief, it's not a matter of an intellectual concept, but it's something that they can feel, they can use. And so it's a similar concept with Brahman that in the Vedic tradition, that's this all pervading consciousness, this universal consciousness that just permeates everything, that gave rise to everything that exists. And through meditation, through other spiritual practices, a person can go inward and touch on that level of Brahman, touch on that level of pure universal consciousness and enliven it. And even during meditation, even um, have a particular idea in mind and manifest that through the meditation by coming to a very, very deep level of the mind, that level where everything is united, whereas there is this universal awareness. So that kind of dovetails with this idea of using the force, to achieve a particular outcome. Because of course, that's what the Jedi do. They don't just feel it, but they also say, okay, I want to accomplish this. I'm going to use the force to do this. So similar to that Eastern idea of manifestation.
Yeah, so it's not, I'm glad you mentioned that it's not just like touching it or feeling it. It's directing it once that connection's felt. I think there's several good examples of that throughout the movie. Yeah, maybe I'll start with the OG movies and the classics, and maybe point out to a scene that you call out in the book, but I think that a lot of people who are Star Wars fans will be familiar with. It's when Luke first meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they decide to go off planet together because Luke's family's been killed, and they're on the Millennium Falcon, and Obi-Wan is starting to try and train Luke. And the scene that takes place is there's like a droid that shoots lasers out, and Luke's got a lightsaber, and he's trying to defend against the blasts. And yeah, not quite as successful as he wants to be. And so Obi-Wan tells him to, put on this helmet and cover his eyes basically, and trust his instincts more or less. And you know, I feel is it, I guess that's a way of using the force, or a demonstration of using the force, not just necessarily feeling it. Would you say that's fair?
Definitely. Yeah, and Obi-Wan says in that scene, your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them. Reach out with your feelings. So again, this theme of the Force being something that's beyond the senses, that the physical senses could even distract you from it. And again, that has a lot of parallels in the Vedic tradition, the teachings of ancient India, that the senses keep the mind directed outwards. And so one of the benefits of the right styles of meditation is that they allow the mind to go inward, to very naturally transcend the level of the senses and to go to deeper layers of reality.
So, there's one quote that I'd written down. I'm going to paraphrase it, but you say that in traditions like the Vedic tradition, it's pointed out that experience is super important. So the experience of meditating, not just intellectually talking about it, but getting in there and doing it's like describing an apple versus eating an apple. And I know personally, I'm very guilty of, being intellectually curious about this stuff, but not being as focused on the meditative practice. And I'm wondering if maybe you could just share a little bit why you think it's so valuable, both in the Star Wars world to connect with the Force, and then just in the Vedic tradition as well to experience yeah, transcendental states, I guess, versus just talking about them.
Sure. I'll actually start with the Vedic perspective and then I'll go into Star Wars a little.
Okay.
But from a Vedic perspective, and more broadly within a lot of Eastern traditions and Eastern philosophies, the ultimate truth of life is not just a philosophy. It's not just something like an intellectual framework for understanding the world. But to really know the ultimate truth of life is to live it, to experience it, to live and breathe it every moment of every day, not through direct effort, but just through spiritual practices that cultivate that state of awareness over time. And so in Eastern traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on the cultivation of higher states of consciousness that are said to be completely natural to human beings. I don't mean altered states like drug-induced states. I mean very natural, systematically cultivated states through spiritual practices that are supposed to be the birthright of every human being to gradually cultivate these states to purify the mind and body, and then eventually to just have them as the basis of every experience in life. And it just makes life that much richer. And so, of course, you still experience all the diversity on the surface of life, but there's just this steadfast level of awareness that can grow. It's sort of like an anchor underneath that, grounding every experience you have, bringing more joy into it. Um, and so, from an Eastern perspective, even though an intellectual understanding may be intriguing to the mind, it's falling very short of the ultimate goal of life. In the Vedic tradition, they'll sometimes use the analogy of a river, that life is like a river that's carrying us towards an ocean, and the ocean could represent ultimate truth, higher states of awareness, satisfaction, fulfillment, the fulfillment of the very potential of life. And so it's the very nature of life to flow towards that goal, to pull us along towards that goal. But as human beings, we have free will. And so we can either paddle with the current or we can paddle against it. And so it's that whole, on a moment by moment basis or a day by day basis, are we choosing things that further our evolution? Are we choosing things that are constructive and life supporting and progressive? And that could be as simple as, um, getting enough sleep, having a healthy diet, purifying the body in those ways. But it also has to do with how we treat others. We want to promote our own evolution and that of everyone around us. And that helps that whole flow of the river towards ultimate fulfillment for everyone. That helps that progress. So again, it's so much more than just an intellectual understanding of things. And yeah, again, there's just a lot of emphasis in the Star Wars movies on feeling the Force, on using the Force, not just a matter of, oh, Luke, you should believe in the Force. Luke, just accept what I tell you on, the basis of blind faith. It's a much deeper approach to what the Force actually is and how it should be intimately integrated into our lives.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, you can see throughout the story too that, um, yeah, at least in Luke's arc, like let's take Luke for example. Obviously, the Star Wars universe is huge, and there's many more important characters beyond Luke. But at the beginning, the Force is kind of just an intellectual thing, right? Like Obi-Wan tells him about it, he's kind of skeptical of it, and then as he goes through his character arc, he starts off like, I guess like an initiate, if you will. Obi-Wan kind of brings him into the fold, and then in the second movie, in Empire Strikes Back, he goes to meet, I guess his next master, Master Yoda, who kind of helps take his understanding of the Force and trains him on how to utilize it to the next level. I actually have a little clip here. I was hoping maybe I could play, and then we could talk about it, where Luke meets Yoda, and then kind of takes, his accelerates his journey and use of the Force from there, I think.
Sounds great.
All right, so I'm just gonna play this clip. Obviously, like I said, it's kind of the next journey, at least I've seen in Luke, maybe making that transition from intellectualizing the Force to, like, he's had a few instances where he started to tap into it and feel it, but he's still kind of on the journey and not fully, um dare I say, one with the Force, or maybe a concept that we'll hopefully get into in a little, but kind of like the full Avatar stage of being one with the Force. All right, I will zip it here, and we'll cut to Yoda, and then we can discuss.
I can't. It's too big. Size matters not. Look at me. Judge me by my size, do you? And where you should not. For my ally is the Force. And a powerful ally it is. Life creates it. Makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and binds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. You must feel the Force around you. Here, between you, me, the tree, the rock, everywhere. Yes. Even between the land and the ship.
All right. I'm gonna stop my share here. Uh, I get the chills every time I watch that. I'm such a dork. I love it so much. But yeah, maybe if you could share any thoughts on the message there that Yoda's saying.
Sure. No, I love that scene too. But yeah, one line that stands out to me in that scene that I talk about in my book is Yoda saying that the Force is his ally. So that's a very good description from an Eastern perspective on the state of enlightenment is just a state where one naturally receives the support of Brahman, to use the Vedic term, or in this case, the Force. That just Yoda is so in tune with the Force. He's so embedded in that state, if you will, that the Force just naturally supports his undertakings. And, he says this line about, Luke says, I'll try to lift the ship. And Yoda says, no, I'm paraphrasing, but do not, do or do not, there is no try. Basically just bringing out this idea that for someone as evolved as he is, it's really not a matter of trying and struggling to do something. It's really a matter of just having the intention. And then in most cases, the Force is just going to make that happen because that's just the level he's operating on. So that's a key phrase that stands out to me in that scene. Again, the focus on feeling the Force. And luminous beings, are we not this crude matter? That's a key line there. Again, in modern times, we're mostly embedded in a physicalist paradigm where we think of everything in very physical terms. We assume that fundamentally everything is matter, or maybe beyond that some sort of unified field, but we see it in very physical terms. And that's not at all the perspective of the Vedic tradition. It's also not the perspective of Star Wars, which is saying that no, there's much more to life than that. There are things well beyond the senses, well beyond the physical, like the Force itself, and we ourselves these luminous beings that happen to be, encased within matter, if you will, but so much more than the physical. So I think there are a lot of deep themes in that scene.
There are, and I appreciate you expanding upon it a little bit. I'm gonna maybe pivot away from Luke for a second, if it's okay, and sort of rewind us to his dad, right? So Luke's not the only one in the family that's kind of tapped into the Force, and as you stated earlier, it's sort of the Vedic belief that it's all our birthright to kind of be tap into the Force, and kind of, in the movie, it's like it almost comes off like the Jedi are the only ones that can tap into it. Which, it's a movie, so and not a direct correlation to Eastern traditions, but um, there's this concept of the avatar, the person that's like in a, I guess, in the book you sort of stated as they will restore Dharma and bring balance to the world. And before Luke ever entered the scene, his dad was thought to be this guy's going to be the Avatar. He's going to be, he was a kid at the time when we first meet him in the prequel movies, Anakin Skywalker, um, and he's thought to bring balance to the Force. And it doesn't quite go that way. But I'm wondering if maybe you can help us. I've obviously butchered the understanding of the Avatar, so maybe you can help us like uh gain a good grasp of what that really is, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about Anakin's character arc as well, and maybe tie that back in with Luke as well, because he kind of, their fates are intertwined, obviously, as most Star Wars fans know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in the Vedic tradition, the idea of an avatar is a direct incarnation of the divine, so of Brahman, of pure universal consciousness. So it's the divine saying, okay, the world has gotten so out of balance, so out of whack, the creative and destructive forces in the world. which in proper balance promote evolution, and we can get into that if we have time.
Yeah.
But when they're out of balance, then evolution stagnates. Then the flow of that river that I talked about earlier, it's blocked. It becomes like more like a trickle. The evolutionary power of nature itself is inhibited. And so the avatar comes at this time of great imbalance, and it sets things right again. So it's a little different than in the Star Wars universe, where these are human beings in a sense. Um, but at the same time, this theme of bringing balance, this theme of someone incarnating at a time and having that very specific role, that does dovetail nicely with the Vedic teachings. And yeah, it was interesting as I delved more deeply into the Star Wars movies. Ultimately, it is Darth Vader, well, Anakin Skywalker, who brings balance to the Force. It's just after this extremely convoluted path to get there where he becomes, Darth Vader and does all these horrific, destructive things. But yes, Luke's role is also extremely important in all that because everyone else had given up on Darth Vader. Everyone else thought he was just, more man than machine, that he was just completely lost to the dark side, could never be redeemed. And Luke sensed otherwise. He had deep intuition, and in spite of all the conflict between them, and in spite of everything that Darth Vader had done, Luke sensed that there was still goodness in him. And so, of course, he goes and he meets Vader in the Return of the Jedi. And initially, Vader denies everything he's saying. He's like, no, 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 no. It's too late for me. I'll just turn you over to the Emperor now. And Luke's very disheartened. But by the end of that scene, we see that Luke manages to inspire his father to return to the light side and to ultimately fulfill that role that he had of bringing balance to the Force. But, it seems pretty clear that it wouldn't have happened without Luke coming there and inspiring his father to come back to the light side.
Yeah, it's cool to see. I guess, we were talking about Luke's sort of trajectory and growth into like connecting with the Force and really using it to achieve the desired outcomes. And I kind of think the pinnacle moment is like he's willing to sacrifice his life and risk his life that he can bring his dad back to the light side of the Force. And I think that almost echoes that sort of universal love mindset that one might have if they were, at a transcendent level of consciousness or like a master Jedi, as we would refer to in the Star Wars universe. Um, I'm glad we're talking about Anakin and Darth Vader too, because you bring up a couple really important concepts when talking about the Force in general. Like it's not all uh, love and light, kind of new age, happy, everything's great kind of thing, right? There's a dark reality or a dark aspect to existence in a sense, and maybe I'm not phrasing it right, but you talk about I think it's a Vedic concept, the three gunas, and kind of talk about how these are the three essential aspects of like maybe creation or existence. I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk to us about what those are, and then if you have any correlates between each and the Star Wars world, love to just hear how you think each of those gunas might relate to a person or an action or a scene or something like that within Star Wars.
Sure. So the three gunas are sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva is the force of creation, so it's associated with light and balance and harmony. Its opposite is tamas, that's the force of destruction, so it's associated with ignorance, with stagnation, with darkness. And then, sort of in the middle, there's this other force, Rajas, which is the force of maintenance. It's a very energetic force, and it can support either of the other two forces. So it kind of gives them power, so to speak. So oftentimes in the Vedic tradition, we'll talk about this on a societal level, that a society at any given point, it could be very sattvic, so meaning very pure, very creative, and it would be at that point being supported by Rajas. So this maintaining supportive quality would be supporting that light quality of sattva. Or a society could be very tamasic, very destructive, lots of violence or danger going on in the society. And in that case, Rajas would be supporting tamas. It would be the maintaining force supporting the destructive force. But these principles apply on every level of life. So, in terms of individual beings, in terms of well, every size of group you can think of, a family, a town, a nation, the whole world, you can think of these principles relating to them. And so any given person has a makeup of all three of the gunas. Um, but they'll have predominances. And so some people will veer more towards certain qualities than others. And as they evolve, those may shift. So they're all there, they're all present. Um, but part of the reason in my book that I go into these concepts is that this idea of balance, the balance between the creative and the destructive forces in particular, is seen as being primary to evolution. That both of them have a role to play in evolution, but they have to be in proper balance or else it causes issues. Um, and you can think of this in terms of because you maybe wonder, well, what possible good could the destructive force do? And the idea is that in proper balance, to create a new state, you need to destroy the old state. And you can use different analogies to talk about this. Like if you have a really beaten up old building and you want to build a beautiful mansion, you're going to have to bulldoze that old building first, then you can build your beautiful mansion. Or out in the middle of the forest, sometimes forest fires are helpful, even though they destroy things at first. They also create a place for new life to grow. And so these concepts are deep in the Vedic tradition. This idea of as long as these forces are in balance, then they can keep playing off of each other and sometimes being supported by Rajas, one being supported, then the other, one, the other, playing off of each other and promoting that evolutionary flow, promoting the flow of the river. And so the real issue, again, is when they're out of balance. And usually this takes the form of the destructive force completely overshadowing the creative force. Um, for anyone who might have heard of the Bhagavad Gita, that's a text in which this tells a story in which it's a time of great destruction where the destructive force is so thoroughly overshadowing the creative force that the natural power of evolution is very much hurt, very much harmed, and that dovetails nicely with a lot of scenes in the Star Wars films, where in most of the movies, the dark side of the Force has overshadowed the light side, and we need to strengthen the light side to bring that balance back.
Yeah, we see that, time and time again, really. That's kind of like the ever playing battle in these movies is like, oh, the dark side's starting to take hold, and we need to figure out a way to sort of bring everything back into balance. I really appreciate what you said, how, the three gunas relate on so many different levels too. Like it could be societal, it could be personal. And I really appreciate even more how you pointed out that, the destructive aspect isn't necessarily always a bad thing, right? Like I think, for example, of myself, like I used to think, oh, the world is this way. I had these mental structures for who I am and, my place in the world. And I found that, by destroying them in a sense, it allowed me to grow and evolve my consciousness. And if I just, held on to those worldviews, I'd kind of be the same person without, I hope I've grown for the better. But I guess the point is like, when I think about what you said for me personally, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see how destructive forces are necessary for, even just my personal evolution. And we,
Makes complete sense. Yeah.
yeah,
Destroying the old state, making way for something better.
yeah, 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 absolutely. And I don't know, maybe going back to a few characters in the Star Wars world, like I think of Luke kind of doing that. Um, when he goes to see Yoda, there's a scene where he like goes like under like tree roots, or it's like kind of like he's in a dark cave, and you know, well, he sees Darth Vader, right? And then, Darth Vader's uh, mask pops off and Luke's looking at himself, and it was sort of this like really violent, scary exchange, right? But I think that was almost like a if I'll share my thoughts. I'm curious yours. It seems like that was like a destructive scene in the sense of, similar to what I mentioned, like Luke was destroying an old concept of himself or even a concept of his dad. Like I think maybe he hated his dad or thought he was purely evil, but then he was able to see himself in his dad, and that might have been, the first step towards, the redemptive arc for his dad. I don't know. That's just kind of my interpretation of it, but I'm curious if you see any relationship to the destructive guna in that scene, or you just have any other further thoughts on it.
That's an interesting scene to me as well. And right before Luke goes in there, Yoda comments that it's a very dark place, and he says that Luke needs to go in there. And Luke asks what's in there, and Yoda says, only what you take with you. And so I wasn't sure in watching that scene, it wasn't completely clear to me what the directors were trying to accomplish with it, but that line about only what you take with you. Um, made me think about times when we may project something onto a scenario, bring some baggage of our own that taints the situation. Like, presumably Yoda could walk into that cave and have a very different experience because he's operating at a higher level. He's a more evolved being at that point. So that was really the line that stuck out to me in that scene. But to be honest, it's a kind of a cryptic scene. I'm not exactly sure what they're trying to accomplish with it.
No, that's fair, and I appreciate you pointing out that line because that is, I think, really important. It's like I've heard somebody say like the only Zen you'll find on a mountaintop is the Zen you bring with you. So I feel like that's kind of yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I guess maybe pivoting away from the Gunas, you know, we haven't really talked about the newer movies yet, and I know you do touch on them as well. It's not just Anakin and Luke, Yoda, all beloved figures of the past, but there was a new era with like Kylo Ren and Rey as sort of the prominent figures, and they have pretty interesting character arcs as well. Kylo Ren he's the son of uh, Princess Leia and Han Solo, right? And his uncle is Luke Skywalker. He's going to train to be a Jedi as well. And then things go bad, and he makes a hard pivot to the dark side. And then, while the movies are going, we're introduced to Rey, who um, we don't know this at the time, but she's the niece of the evil Emperor Senator Palpatine, or maybe the granddaughter, uh,
Granddaughter.
granddaughter. And I don't know. I just found it interesting that like you have these lineages. One's supposed to represent the goodness, and one's supposed to represent the bad, but um, it doesn't really mean anything in for their arcs, right? Like Rey is not destined to become this bad person, and Kylo Ren is or Ben is not, destined to always be this good person. Now he does have a redemptive arc at the end where, he helps, he gives his life to save Rey, but I'm curious if the concept of like Dharma pops up in your mind when you thought about either of their life paths or trajectories in the movie.
Definitely. Just for your audience, they may not be familiar. Dharma, like on a more cosmic level, Dharma means the evolutionary power of nature itself. So it's like the river I talked about earlier. It's that force that's propelling everything towards great fulfillment, greater satisfaction, just higher and higher levels of reality. But Dharma also has a personal application in that every individual being has their own Dharma. And oftentimes people think about this in terms of career. They'll say, oh, it's my dharma to be a teacher, or it's my dharma to be a banker, or whatever it happens to be. It's a little more complex than that. That's part of it. Other aspects of Dharma could include spiritual practices. They could include family connections. Maybe it's someone's Dharma to be a spouse or a parent, to have certain hobbies. So, it's a complex topic, but it's basically the path of evolution that is suited to that individual, that aligns with their natural tendencies. And so, just to take a step back before I go into the sequel movies, Dharma, personal Dharma, I see as a very important theme in Luke's journey as a young man, because he starts out and he's been raised by farmers, his adoptive aunt and uncle, and his uncle really wants him to stay in that occupation. But it's just completely unnatural to Luke. It goes completely against his natural tendencies. He has no affinity for it. He has no desire for that. And, his natural abilities, his connection with the Force and so forth are much better aligned with him being a Jedi Knight, a rebel fighter, even a pilot. He's a gifted pilot naturally. So again, this theme of what's actually appropriate with one's natural tendencies, what will cause evolution for that person. And for Luke, it's not what he was born into. It's this whole other path that he ends up taking. Um, so I used his story because I think it's a very simple, straightforward example of this idea of personal dharma. But I think you could definitely apply it to pretty much any character in the Star Wars universe. Um, in terms of both Rey and Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren taking a much more convoluted path, but I think we do see both of them, gradually over time evolving, becoming greater versions of themselves by the end. Um, yeah, it's a great topic.
Well, I appreciate you bringing it back to Luke for, the Dharma conversation specifically, because it does seem like that is like the most glaringly obvious example. Like, on the one hand, he's got the pressure from the family, and gosh, I mean, is that a familiar story for a lot of people, right? Like, I'm being told I should go live this one life, but my intuition is calling me somewhere else. And, I mean, the story doesn't happen really if Luke doesn't take the risk and change trajectories and follow. I mean, as the mythologist Joseph Campbell would say, follow your bliss. Now sure, he had help, and circumstances helped him move that direction, but I can see a lot of correlation between the concept of following your bliss and like uh the flow of the river, as you mentioned. Like, if you're doing always what society tells you, or maybe parents or just outside influences, let's say, you might be swimming against the river just because that's what you're being told, versus like tapping in, and centering yourself, and oh, I'm in the river, and if I just flow this way, that's the way I should really be going.
Absolutely, and it's great that you bring up Joseph Campbell, because you already know, he very much influenced George Lucas's original screenplay for the Star Wars movies. That George Lucas actually intentionally went back and rewrote parts of the screenplay to better make them align with Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell had this very universal perspective of life also, that the same myths were found in lots of different cultures across the world. And so and he was also influenced by the Vedic tradition. I mean, even just the idea of following your bliss, that's a very Vedic concept. So it is cool to see all these points line up.
Yeah, I think I first learned about it. If anybody isn't hip to Joseph Campbell, I think Bill Moyers did a great series of interviews with him in the past. I think they're free out on the internet, so definitely go check out his work. Obviously, read this book first, for all our Star Wars fans. But it's very highly relatable, and yeah, I guess it did influence George Lucas, as you're saying. I guess, uh, maybe pivoting, like we've talked about the Vedic tradition a lot, but you also point out in the book that there's other traditions as well. Like, these are universal truths you sort of highlighted or uncovered within the Star Wars world. I have a few notes on some, but I'm wondering if, any like stand out to you top of mind that you'd want to point out to the audience, whether it's from Christianity, Judaism. I think you mentioned Sufism as well in the book. So, um, uh, anything that comes to mind in terms of the universal truths for those religions that you'd want to mention?
Definitely. So in my book, I go into both Eastern and Western traditions and also even into Native American and First Nations teachings. But yeah, some of the specific ones I look at on the Eastern side, of course, the Vedic tradition, but also Buddhism, Taoism, and Sikhism. And then on the more Western side, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And really, for most of the principles where there are these very clear parallels with the Vedic tradition, there are also parallels with all these other traditions. The Vedic tradition itself has a very universal emphasis. It says that reality is one, the wise speak of it in different ways. That's a quote from the Rig Veda. Meaning that the ultimate reality of life is the same in all contexts, all times, for all places, all people. But people use different words to describe it. So the wise speak of it in different ways. Um, and so many of these principles we just see showing up again and again across different religions, across different cultures. A simple one is the idea of the force. Again, in the Vedic tradition, that's Brahman, that's universal consciousness that permeates everything. We see very similar idea to that within Sikhism, for instance. In Taoism, that's a Chinese religion. In Taoism, it's similar to the Tao, this force that permeates everything, that everything in life is said to be the flow of the Tao. So that lines up very nicely with Star Wars also. But also, even in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, certain passages in the Bible, for instance, describe God in very abstract terms as something all pervading. There's even a line that says, in him we live and move and have our being. So, not so much the sense of a very anthropomorphic, a very, human-like character directing events, but much more this sense of this omnipresent reality that's just everywhere and directing everything that happens. So yeah, the force itself being something all pervading, that lines up very nicely across many different religious traditions. Also ideas like the force being something that's within. Ray brings that topic up in the sequel trilogy. And that all definitely lines up with these different religions and philosophies as well. That there's some level of reality, whether you call it Brahman or the Tao or the kingdom of God, but something that's within that one can reach through meditation, through prayer, through other spiritual practices. Um, yeah, concepts like "May the Force be with you." That's most commentators agree that that is a play on the Christian saying, "May the Lord be with you." So of course, seeking the support of something greater than oneself, the divine in one's undertakings. It even lines up with various Native American and First Nations prayers that are reaching out to some greater being, seeking support in different aspects of their lives. Oh, and I should mention that the Great Spirit also lines up nicely with the idea of the Force. Again, this all-pervading thing that's found within, but also just in every aspect of life. So to bring the Native American tradition into the conversation as well. Yeah, I could go on. There are quite a few.
No, no. I mean, that's great. That's a great like little glimpse into how it's not just specific to the comparisons to the Vedic scene, but it really is sort of the Force has universal parallels, and Star Wars has a lot of universal parallels in those different philosophies. And I really am glad you brought up the First Nation. And Native Americans often underrepresented, so I'm glad that you can point that out to people. Um, one thing you said too about what when you were going through that was the concept of the force being within, or I think in your book you like point out like a verse in the Bible. I think it was like Luke uh, 17 verse
21.
21. Yeah, and the concept that the kingdom of heaven is within, and um, there's a scene in the newer Star Wars movies. I think it's the 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 last of the new trilogy, where Yoda uh, like a, calls in a lightning bolt on a tree with a Jedi teaching, a book of Jedi teachings in it or something, and the book catches on fire, and Luke's like, no way, like Ren or I'm sorry, Rey needs those teachings, and again paraphrasing, but like Yoda basically says, like she's got all she needs within, basically, like she already knows how to go within, and that's really all you need to know.
Definitely. Yeah, in the Vedic tradition, it says that to an enlightened individual, all the texts in the world are, what is it exactly? It's they have the value of a well in a place where it's surrounded by water on all sides. Like it's just like you're on an island or something. There's this huge ocean around you of water. We'll say it's drinkable for the sake of the analogy. um, and to an enlightened person, the texts are like a well when you're already just surrounded by water. So really their purpose of the spiritual texts is to help people along the path, to help them evolve. But once one reaches the goal, once one reaches that ocean at the end of the river, the texts really become unnecessary.
Well, we have a few minutes left, and you kind of just uh, piqued my or reminded me of something I wanted to discuss that is correlated to the end as well. The kind of concept of death in these traditions as well as in Star Wars. Like, Star Wars doesn't outright like kind of promote reincarnation, but there very much is like a continuance. Like I think you're just saying the final destination of the river is kind of like this ocean or big body of water. I kind of got that vibe with Star Wars, right? Like if someone passed, they ended up somewhere in a greater place. I don't know if greater is the right word, but they ended up somewhere, and there was a continuity of sorts. I'm wondering maybe if you could just share some thoughts about, the afterlife as you see it from these traditions, as well as, the correlations to Star Wars.
Definitely. I should just mention that from the Vedic tradition standpoint, depending on the school of thought you're listening to, it's actually possible to reach that ocean, so to speak, before death.
Yeah.
And so, certain traditions they say, oh, basically you become enlightened when you die, but other traditions, including certain lines of thought in the Vedic tradition, say, oh no, you can cultivate that state of awareness and live it in your life, and even for decades, whatever, until you pass on. So just so I your audience is clear on that.
No, that's
um
that's a great point. That's kind of like the goal, right? Is to have that to reach that point and then exist in that state. Don't, not waiting, like a Christianity might be like your salvation comes after death. The Vedic Christian's way different. Like, no, you can have peace and unitive experience while alive. Uh,
exactly.
yeah, thank you for pausing and making that clear, because that's, everybody, we should all be trying for that. That sounds like a really nice place to be for all of us while
we're
we're alive instead of waiting till we're dead.
worth aspiring to, yeah. No problem. Um, but yeah, but you're absolutely right that the Star Wars texts have this. I mean, Star Wars texts. The Star Wars films have this concept of immortality, that death is not the ultimate end. And so while the Sith do everything to avoid death or even to counteract death, the Jedi, they see it as a natural part of life. They don't see it as something to be avoided at all costs. I think there are worse things than dying, like losing one's honor. It's much more important to have integrity, even if one ends up dying. And of course, part of that is because there is this idea of immortality, and we see that in different ways in the Star Wars films. We see it in terms of the four spirits, so the individual Jedi having individual immortalities, Obi-Wan and Yoda and other Jedi too, who show up in this glimmering form and can communicate with the living, to help guide them and stuff. But there's this idea of life after death. And in other places, Yoda makes comments that suggest that at death, everyone merges with the Force. So there's this kind of universal immortality, if you will, of just becoming one with this essence at death. So it's a slightly different perspective than the Vedic teachings I was talking about. But at the same time, just this emphasis on a continuation, an emphasis on nothing ever ultimately ending in that way. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic.
It is, and I can't help but think of uh, the sort of themes I see in society today with like the transhumanist movement, where like people are want to like think there's going to be the possibility to escape death by merging with machines, or you start replacing body parts with machines, or like copy your consciousness into a computer kind of thing. And I won't I'm not trying to be judgmental, but that kind of has the Sith vibe to me. Like people are going to do whatever it takes to stay quote unquote alive. No offense to anybody who thinks that's cool. Everybody's entitled to do what they want, but that popped into mind right now, like that uh, I have to stay alive at any cost kind of mindset, and you see it like with the Emperor, who we think we get rid of in Return of the Jedi, but somehow he's managed to survive, and he's hooked up to all these machines, and he looks 10 times scarier than he did in the first movies. So I don't know if it was worth it or not. But yeah, it's interesting. I appreciate you bringing in, the life after death uh, concepts to the table here. So much to ponder. We are right at the sort of top of the hour, so I want to be respectful of your time and say thank you so much for coming on and doing this. This is like I could blab and ask you questions all day, and the book was so fun to read. I really couldn't put it down once I picked it up, and I underlined it, highlighted it, and it's like um, made me want to go back and watch all the Star Wars movies again and kind of like have that handy with me as I go through and just kind of be like, oh yeah, 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 and then pause it and like have a debate about it with friends. Like I feel like that would be fun. In fact, I would encourage everybody who's gonna watch this to read the book, and then maybe get your friends to read it too, and then you can go back and watch Star Wars and sort of uh, have a book club debate about these universal themes. It really does open up such big questions like that are always fun to talk about, and to do it in relation to a series of movies that people are so passionate about and love so much. I think is just tremendous. Like I think it's a tremendous gift you're giving all of us by pointing this stuff out, and I hope that people that have loved Star Wars forever, but don't quite know why the themes resonate so much. I hope they give your book a chance, because I think, for people who, especially people who haven't delved into comparative religion or philosophy, I think they'll find that what you raised throughout the book um, points out why these things resonate with people so much, why the films resonate. There's these universal truths that, no matter your race, creed, sex, gender, whatever, like that they're there, and they're across time and history and people, and they seem to just be at the core of the human experience. And so yeah, long ramble to say people go out and please read Dr. Krista Noble's book. She put a lot of thought into it. It's very fun to go through, and it's a perfect homage to a great series in Star Wars. And I guess before, I say final goodbye and thank you, I always try and ask people, is there anything top of mind for you? One blurb that you'd want to leave us with, whether about your book or just what's important to you these days that you might want to share to everybody.
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say thanks so much. I'm passionate about these subjects, so it's wonderful to be able to share them with others. And when they resonate with others, that's even better. So, no, I really appreciate that. Yeah, there's so many things that we could go into. I guess I'll just bring up the idea that part of the purpose of my book is to show that the philosophy of the Jedi doesn't only apply in a galaxy far, far away, but that it's actually highly relevant to everyday living. And that, like Luke Skywalker, we should all look within to discover the deepest truths of life and pursue our individual destinies and strive to reach our full potential as human beings. So, just kind of bringing it from the abstract topics, which I love, but also down on a more concrete level that, on a day-to-day basis, we can make choices that promote our evolution and that help to bring about these goals we've been talking about. So for viewers, you can find my book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, basically the major online book retailers. And you can also follow my professional activities and hear other talks from me at my website, which is just kristanoble.com. So KRISTANOBLE.com.
All right, awesome. Well, I will just say thank you one more time. It's been an absolute treasure of an experience to talk to you and to talk about this awesome book.